want to ask you a question. Are you really sure we're living in the last days? This is a question, I think, on the minds of a lot of people as we consider what has been happening in recent years. In our magazine, the January edition of Prophecy in the News, we asked the question, will the world end after 6,000 years? And we have a 10,000-word article here suggesting that Christ is coming soon. And then, in the February edition of our newspaper, we continued this article with another 7,000 words. Gary Stimman is here to discuss with me what I think is the most important question. Gary, are we really living in the last days?
JR, 6,000 and counting. Well, we're counting up to 6,000 from Adam, and we're about to experience the turn of the millennium. We've been asking the question, are we really living in the last days? We've talked about time prophecy. We've talked about Israel as God's timepiece. We're going to focus today on the times of the Gentiles and what the ancient Old Testament prophets had to say about the Gentiles, and then we're going to bring that into the New Testament context and also into the context of current events as we see them in today's world.
To begin with, as we go back into the early pages of the Bible, we find God promising Abraham, through your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Basically, it says, through Abraham's chosen people and his chosen seed, the Lord Jesus Christ, the Gentiles will be blessed. Well, when we come to Moses and the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, we have a narrowing of this concept. In fact, God says that the Jews have moved him to jealousy because of their vanities, and he says, I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. That's a reference to the Gentiles. God has spoken here that he will turn from the Jews to the Gentiles, but in order to make the Jews jealous.
And you know, those not a people were literally everybody but Israel.
Yes.
And that's a staggering thought, that God focused in on a tiny nation of people whom he chose. And by the way, he had chosen them from the time of the Abrahamic covenant, JR, to really to send out his message across the entire earth.
Absolutely. And when we come down to the fulfillment of this, as is given in Romans chapter 10, the Apostle Paul quotes this passage again from Deuteronomy 32. And Romans 10:19 he says, but I say, did not Israel know? First Moses saith, I will provoke you to jealousy by them that are no people, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. Well, in the next chapter he tells us who those people are which are not a people and that foolish nation. He says in verse 11 of chapter 11, I say then, have they stumbled, that is Israel, that they should fall? God forbid. In other words, the Jew, or the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes of Jacob, have not been forever forsaken, as some think. But rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. So here he tells us that these people that are no people that the Lord is going to use to provoke Israel to jealousy are Gentiles.
And by the way, this brings up an interesting point. As Paul was writing in Romans, quoting the Old Testament prophecy, he was writing in a language that a lot of his early letters were obviously written in Koine Greek, which was then the common language. And by the providence of God, the New Testament then came to be written in Koine Greek because it was the common language of the Gentiles in that era, and it was also a very precise language. Well, this fulfilled much prophecy, including Isaiah 28:11, to name one, where we read, for with stammering, that is, or strange lips, and another tongue will he speak to this people. And this is concerning the teaching of Scripture. That is the interpretation of the Old Testament prophecies. The Lord prophesied through Isaiah that he would speak to the dispersed of Israel with a strange tongue. And this was fulfilled with our own New Testament.
Yes. With the Greek language instead of the Hebrew of the Old Testament.
That's right.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And, you know, in this Romans chapter 11, verse 25, he talks about this times of the Gentiles, And he refers to it here as the fullness of the Gentiles. Listen to it. He says, I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So here we talk about the fullness of the Gentiles. Now, there are some theologians who make a differentiation between the times of the Gentiles, which began with Nebuchadnezzar, Gentile rule over Jerusalem, and the fullness of the Gentiles, which appears to be a reference to Gentile Christianity. But Gary, when it all boils down to it, Gentiles are involved.
Gentiles are involved in many, many ways, and in two ways specifically. The Bible recognizes three specific groups of people. The Jews, of course, the Gentiles, and the church. That is, those who are called out of the Gentiles for the name of the Lord. We read in Luke 21:24 concerning the destruction of Jerusalem as prophesied by the Lord himself. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And many, J.R., have wondered, what does that phrase, times of the Gentiles, really mean?
Well, it would take us back to Daniel chapter 2 and the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. Their first invasion was in around 606 B.C. Around 597, there was a second invasion, and then began the deportations. And in 587, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple. And Daniel was one of those who was carried into captivity. Because he was of noble birth, he became one of the advisors, or one of the young men in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And he interpreted a dream Nebuchadnezzar had. Give us an idea of what this dream is about, Gary.
Well, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream. By the way, the wise men of Babylon were unable to interpret the dream. But providentially, Daniel, in his court, was called upon and interpreted the dream, in which Nebuchadnezzar said he had a dream about a great statue with a head of gold and the chest and arms of silver and the belly of brass and down to the waist, and then into the legs and the feet it was iron, and when it got to the feet the iron was mixed with clay. So here's this multi-metallic statue. And a strange dream. It obviously impressed him a great deal, and his wise men couldn't tell him what it was. Daniel told him what it was.
Yeah. Thou art that head of gold. Thus begins Gentiles taking over Israel, taking over Jerusalem, and ruling. And so Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom was the first, the head of gold. Then came the Medes and the Persians, typified by the silver. And Greece, typified by the brass. And finally Rome, typified by the legs of iron.
Yeah.
In the end time, there will be a world kingdom, the concluding kingdom of these times of the Gentiles. And it will be made up of iron, partly of the Roman Empire, and partly of clay. Some say that represents totalitarianism mixed with democracy. I don't know that that would exactly be the final view of it, but certainly sounds close.
You know, J.R., the times of the Gentiles are most interesting because it's a closed time. In other words, it begins at a discrete moment. In Daniel 2:38, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, thou art that head of gold. And then he says, after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. The fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. And he's talking about Gentile kingdoms. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold, the official birthday of Babylon is generally given around 625 B.C. So let's just arbitrarily say that, in fact, we spent some time on a previous broadcast talking about this, that maybe that is the beginning of the head of gold. If you laid that statue out across history, by the time you get down to the feet, it's going to be X number of years later.
And so this represents a timeline.
It represents a timeline, exactly. And I believe that we can make a very good persuasive case for the fact that the timeline comes up to our day. That is the feet and the toes of the statue, the 10 toes representing 10 control points, regions of control, 10, some people say 10 nations,
Yeah.
would then bring us right down to the present day.
Well, Gary, history proved that the head of gold, Babylon, came and went.
Right.
And that the Medo-Persians Empire came and went. And the Grecian Empire came and went. And the Roman Empire, those legs of iron, came and went. But in this generation, we have seen a revival of what politicians have called a new world order. The possibility of establishing 10 kingdoms together, 10 economic, political regions of the world. How neatly that fits with the 10 toes on that beast.
Indeed it does. And to Daniel was given the very specific role of being the prophet concerning the times of the Gentiles.
More than any other prophet in the Bible,
yes,
Daniel is the definitive one on the times of the Gentiles.
He really is. And by the way, not only does he lay out a timeline leading from the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, 625 BC, and we've already discussed, if you count that wonderful number of years forward, 2,520 years, 625 BC brings you to 1897 AD and the first Zionist Congress, in which Israel began to rise out of the ashes of the dispersion.
And it was in that year, at that occasion in Basel, Switzerland, that Theodor Herzl said, "Today I have created the state of Israel." He went on to say, maybe nobody knows about it yet, but in 50 years, everybody in the world will know it.
Wonderful.
1897, fascinating date, isn't it?
It is. Now there's something else that Daniel was given, and that is he was given the definitive series of prophecies concerning what's called the little horn, the man of sin, the willful king. In the New Testament, he's further defined as the Antichrist. But J.R. Daniel writes about the Antichrist in a very special way, detailed way.
Yeah. Alexander the Great was the main person that I think Daniel was talking about and referred to him or his progeny, or at least zeroed in on Alexander the Great as the one who someday would be the, what shall we call it, the archetype of the Antichrist. And it's kind of fascinating that there are some in Egypt today, just recently, who claim they have discovered
that's right,
the grave, the tomb of Alexander the Great. What a discovery that would be, and what an interesting time for that discovery to be made.
Yeah, why just today? As a matter of fact, as we tape this is in the newspapers, Alexander's tomb discovered. And they're not saying maybe we've discovered Alexander's tomb. In the articles that I've read, they've found inscriptions that verify the fact. This is the royal tomb of Alexander, and the tomb was actually sealed by Ptolemy, one of Alexander's offspring, who later became an Egyptian ruler.
Incredible. Now, you see, Alexander the Great died in Babylon.
Yes.
But his 4 generals who were there, I guess, at his deathbed, decided they would divide up the kingdom, and the Ptolemies took Egypt. And so evidently Ptolemy took Alexander's body back to Egypt for burial. Why in this particular place, Gary?
It was said that Alexander had received an oracle there, a divine oracle, that from some kind of an ancient mystic who prophesied that he would rule the entire earth. And this was the beginning of his mission. And so those who cared for his body felt that it would be suitable, most appropriate for him to be buried where that oracle was given. That's the current story, and it's going to be fascinating to find out. But Daniel chapter 8 talks about something interesting. The first 7 chapters of Daniel are written in the Aramaic language. There is an abrupt shift when you get to Daniel chapter 8, because suddenly it begins to be written in Hebrew. And the prophecies from here on concern Antichrist. And we have in Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, the prophecy of the ram. And then in Daniel chapter 8, verses 5 through 8, a prophecy concerning a figure called the he-goat. And then in verses 9 through 12, we have a prophecy concerning the little horn. And J.R., what we have here is a definitive genealogical lineage, starting with Alexander and coming down to the little horn, the person of the Antichrist. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, Gary. You know, the fascinating thing about this is that chapter 8 and following in Daniel are so clear.
They are.
You can see this in history as it was fulfilled, and all the way down until this great horn was broken in verse 8, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. This would be the 4 generals of the dying Alexander the Great, who took over the Greek Empire, and from one of those will come this little horn. Out of one of them came forth a little horn, verse 9 says. And this little horn, according to Josephus, Jewish historian, says that Antiochus Epiphanes from the house of the Seleucids, who sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem in 168 BC, he was the Antichrist, or the little horn of Daniel, to commit the abomination of desolation described in chapter 9.
And by the way, the little horn was more than just a powerful ruler in the flesh. This man was empowered spiritually, because we read in Daniel 8:23, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. This king is an occultist.
Yeah.
And we find in the track of the Antichrist occultism, right down to the present age, literally, a train of occultism.
This next verse, Gary, it says, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power.
Yeah.
See, it is a demonic power that is given to this little horn, this Antichrist lineage. Now, this provides a Grecian link then to the Antichrist.
It does indeed.
And now it comes down to the Seleucid link, one of the 4 generals who ruled Syria. And from there, the Seleucids then, if we could follow the lineage of the Seleucids, the family tree of the Seleucid dynasty, we should be able to find the Antichrist.
As a matter of fact, after the death of Alexander the Great, and this is all given, and in particular, in great detail in Daniel chapter 11, after Alexander's death, one of the 4 generals named Seleucus was given rule over the territory that we would now think of today as Syria, part of Asia Minor, part of Persia, part of Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. He was given rule over that territory. And among his offspring then arose Antiochus Epiphanes, the archetype of the Antichrist. And J.R., the house of Antiochus intermarried with the royal houses of Rome. And that house of Antiochus was called the Seleucid dynasty. That Seleucid dynasty, out of Alexander the Great, intermarried with the Caesars of Rome, and there they sort of march off the pages of history in the 1st century.
Wow. So we go from Alexander the Great, or from the times of the Gentiles, pulling it down to a Greek link with the Antichrist, moving it on down then to a Greek-Roman link.
Greco-Roman link.
Antichrist.
Absolutely.
Fascinating.
And by the way, entwined in this whole household are Herodians, other pretenders to the throne of Israel.
Yeah.
And they all intermarried back in that 1st century, a very key time when Jesus was alive and walking the earth.
Now, the fascinating thing about these rulers of Rome, these Caesars, is that over a period of time, we finally come down to a Frankish king by the name of Merovee, who fathered what is called the Merovingian dynasty. And in our book, Guardians of the Grail and the Men Who Planned to Rule the World, I have 9 pages here, Gary, that tells the family tree from Merovee down to the present time.
Very carefully researched, by the way.
Oh, yes, of course, everything documented here. And I'm convinced that Merovee was, as a matter of fact, he claimed to be of Greek descent.
Yes, he did.
And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he wasn't one of the Seleucids.
Now, the Bible goes to great length through the prophet Daniel. It goes to great length to draw a line from Alexander the Great down through Seleucus, down through the royal houses of Rome, and we leave that lineage in, say, about 95, 96 AD, and perhaps 350, 375 years later,
Yeah.
up springs Merovee. We have a little gap in history, but J.R., I would guess that somewhere there's a genealogy that could be traced.
Merovee claimed to be a descent from the Trojans, and the Trojans were descent from the Spartans of Greece.
Yeah.
And so here we have these fighters like the generals, you know, these leaders of Alexander the Great's army. The Seleucids certainly were a part of those fighting men of the Spartan descent. And so we've got the Merovingian dynasty, and we bring it all the way down to the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and the great Habsburg dynasty. It's all listed right here. Father, son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, all the way down through the past 1,600 years.
Now, these are the people in power today. We're talking about people who are in power at the top of global organizations. For example, the World Trade Organization, international banking cartels, the wheelers and dealers, the movers and shakers are people who claim descent from this very lineage, and they are the people who, for example, are forging what is called the peace process in the Middle East. They're the people who are controlling the flow of oil. They're the people who use the term New World Order. And J.R., this prophetically brings us down to the times that Daniel talked about.
Yes. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. Various and sundry names are given, but these are the royal dynasties of the ancient past that are bringing about a new world order. And fascinating that they are suggesting that the world be divided up into 10 economic political regions.
It looks like the times of the Gentiles began to expire about 1897. Not fully, because really the expiration won't come until the Messiah of Israel arrives to take his people to power. But J.R., we've got to be close to the expiration date of the times of the Gentiles.
Yes, we're on our way out. In fact, you know, Romans 11 says that fullness of the Gentiles be come in. In other words, one of these days it'll be all over and Jesus will return.